Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
What if surrender in twin flame union does not mean giving up? What if it is not about walking away, becoming numb, or pretending you no longer care? Because the truth is, many people say just surrender. But almost no one explains what surrender actually feels like when your soul is still aching, when the bond still feels real, and when part of you is terrified that letting go means losing everything. So what is the real meaning of surrender in twin flame union? Is it detachment? Is it trust? Is it silence? Or is it the moment you stop trying to control what only truth can bring into form? In this video, we'll go deeply into why surrender is so misunderstood, why it feels like death to the ego, and why true surrender may be the very thing that opens the door to real union. Chapter 1: Surrender is not giving up. There is one word on the twin flame journey that gets repeated constantly and misunderstood almost every single time. Surrender. People say it as if it is simple, as if it is obvious, as if the soul should just know how to do it. Just surrender. Let go. Trust the process. Stop chasing. Release attachment. But what do those words actually mean when your heart is still aching? What do they mean when the bond still feels real? When the separation still feels sacred and unbearable? When every part of you feels like it is being asked to release the one thing that gave your pain meaning? This is where the real confusion begins. Because most people hear the word surrender and immediately translate it as giving up. Giving up on the person. Giving up on the union. Giving up on the bond. Giving up on hope. Giving up on love itself. And that misunderstanding creates so much unnecessary suffering. Because the soul resists what the ego thinks surrender means. The ego says, if I surrender, I will lose them. If I surrender, I am admitting it is over. If I surrender, I am betraying the connection. If I surrender, I am letting go of the only thing that still feels sacred in all this pain. So naturally, surrender feels terrifying. Not peaceful. Not spiritual. Not soft. Terrifying. Because from the perspective of the wounded self, surrender sounds like abandonment. It sounds like death. And in one sense it is. But not the death of love. The death of control. That is the paradox almost no one explains deeply enough. Surrender in twin flame union is not the end of love. It is the end of the way fear has been holding love. And those are not the same thing at all. This is why true surrender feels so difficult. Because you are not being asked to stop feeling. You are being asked to stop using feeling as a way to control the outcome. You are not being asked to become numb. You are being asked to remain open without collapsing. You are not being asked to deny the bond. You are being asked to stop gripping the bond through panic, obsession, and emotional survival. That is much harder than people realize. Because for many souls on this path, the twin flame connection becomes more than just love. It becomes meaning. It becomes identity. It becomes the explanation for pain. It becomes the promise that everything you suffered is leading somewhere sacred. So when someone says surrender, what the heart often hears is, release the meaning. Release the promise. Release the hope. Release the future you built around this. No wonder the soul resists. No wonder surrender feels impossible at first. Because the ego cannot tell the difference between releasing control and losing what it loves. That is the opening wound of this entire chapter. Most people think surrender means this. I stop caring. I walk away emotionally. I detach from the bond. I pretend I do not love them anymore. I shut down so I do not hurt. But none of that is true surrender. That is self-protection. That is emotional shutdown. That is pain trying to disguise itself as spirituality. Real surrender is something far more sacred and far more demanding. Real surrender says, I still love. I still feel. I still honor what is true. But I am no longer willing to carry this bond through fear. That is a very different thing. Because now surrender is not about becoming less loving. It is about becoming less controlled by the part of you that believes love must be managed, forced, monitored, predicted, or emotionally clutched in order to remain real. And that part of you is usually terrified. Terrified of uncertainty. Terrified of silence. Terrified of not knowing when or how union will happen. Terrified that if you stop pushing inwardly, nothing will ever move again. So the ego keeps gripping. It checks signs, replays stories, monitors the timeline, builds fantasies, decodes every shift in energy, treats love like something that must be held tightly or else it will disappear. And because of that, the connection becomes mixed with pressure. Pressure to happen. Pressure to return. Pressure to prove itself. Pressure to become visible quickly enough to calm the pain. That pressure is what surrender asks you to release. Not the love. The pressure. Not the soul bond. The panic around the soul bond. Not the desire for union. The fear that says union must happen in a certain way, on a certain timeline, or else your whole world will collapse. That is what dies in surrender. And yes, it hurts. It hurts because the ego was using control as protection. It was using obsession as structure. It was using longing as identity. It was using signs as emotional oxygen. It was using the future as the place where peace would finally be allowed. Then surrender comes in and says, no, peace must begin here. Truth must begin here. You cannot keep handing your breath over to what has not yet taken form. That feels unbearable to the wounded self. Because the wounded self wants to ask, then what am I supposed to hold on to? If I stop controlling, if I stop monitoring, if I stop making this bond my emotional survival system, then what is left? And the answer is both beautiful and frightening. Only truth. And truth feels naked compared to obsession. Truth is quieter than fantasy, cleaner than longing, less dramatic than emotional collapse. Truth says, you can love without gripping. You can feel without forcing. You can honor the bond without abandoning yourself to it. You can desire union without turning it into your only reason to breathe. That is surrender. Not losing the sacred. Stripping the sacred of distortion. That is why surrender is so often misunderstood as weakness. Because it does not look like chasing. It does not look like doing more. It does not look like spiritual performance. It looks like stillness. And stillness is threatening to the ego. Because in stillness, it can no longer keep pretending control is the same thing as devotion. That is one of the hardest truths on this path. Sometimes what you called devotion was really fear of losing the story. Fear of not being chosen. Fear of the bond meaning less than you hoped. Fear that if union does not happen, then your suffering will never fully make sense. So you hold tighter. Not because your love is false, but because your pain is trying to protect itself from helplessness. And helplessness is exactly what surrender exposes. You cannot make divine timing obey fear. You cannot force union through enough pain. You cannot think your way into peace. You cannot spiritually bargain your way out of uncertainty. At some point, the soul has to face this. And that facing is surrender. Not passive resignation. Honest release. Release of the illusion that the ego can carry what only truth can carry. This is why surrender often feels like the end of the old self. The old self knew how to wait through obsession, knew how to survive through signs, knew how to build hope through fantasy, knew how to remain connected through suffering. But surrender asks for a different self. A self who can remain open without being consumed. A self who can feel deeply without turning feeling into emergency. A self who can love without demanding constant proof in return. That self is not cold. That self is not detached in the wounded sense. That self is strong. Soul strong. And becoming that self is one of the hardest initiations of the twin flame journey. Because it asks you to release not what is true, but everything in you that has been trying to own truth through fear. So when we say surrender is not giving up, this is what we mean. You're not giving up on love. You're giving up on control as your way of relating to love. You're not giving up on union. You're giving up on the belief that fear must manage union in order for it to happen. You're not giving up on the soul connection. You're giving up on the emotional architecture that kept turning the connection into pressure, obsession, and pain. That is why surrender feels so sacred. Because beneath the grief of letting go of control, there is a deeper opening, a quieter heart, a cleaner field, a love that no longer needs to scream to feel real. And that is where the journey begins to change. Not because you stopped loving, but because for the first time, you stopped calling fear love. That is the real beginning of surrender. And once that truth enters the heart, the next question becomes unavoidable. If surrender is not giving up, then why is it so deeply misunderstood in twin flame teachings? Chapter 2: Why surrender is so misunderstood in twin flame teachings. Surrender is one of the most repeated teachings on the twin flame journey. And yet, it is also one of the least truly explained. People say it constantly. Just surrender. You need to let go. Union comes when you surrender. Stop chasing and surrender to divine timing. These phrases sound spiritual. They sound wise. They sound like they carry truth. But for many people deep in the pain of this journey, they do not feel helpful at all. They feel vague, frustrating, almost cruel. Because when someone is heartbroken, spiritually shaken, emotionally attached to a connection that feels deeper than ordinary love, the word surrender does not land as peace. It lands as confusion. What exactly am I surrendering? Am I surrendering the person? The hope? The bond? The future? My feelings? The belief that this connection means something sacred? This is why surrender is so misunderstood in twin flame teachings. The word is often given as advice without the emotional depth required to hold what it actually asks. Of the soul. And when a word that's sacred is oversimplified, it becomes dangerous. Because then people start interpreting surrender through pain instead of truth. They hear surrender and think, I have to stop caring. I have to numb myself. I have to act detached. I have to suppress my feelings. I have to pretend I no longer want union. That is not surrender. That is self-abandonment disguised as spirituality. And sadly, many people fall into that trap because they were never taught the difference. This is one of the deepest problems in spiritual twin flame spaces. Words like surrender, divine timing, union, detachment, letting go, and trust are repeated so often that they start sounding complete. But repetition is not the same as understanding. A phrase can be spiritually correct and still emotionally useless if it is not explained at the level of lived reality. And lived reality is where the suffering is. Not in abstract ideas. In the body. In the nervous system. In the silence after no contact. In the ache of missing someone who feels tied to your soul. In the fear that releasing control means losing the only thing that still feels sacred. So when teachings say surrender, but do not explain what surrender actually feels like inside a human being carrying that kind of pain. The teaching becomes distorted. It turns into pressure. Pressure to seem spiritual. Pressure to stop hurting too fast. Pressure to pretend peace before peace is real. Pressure to bypass the very emotional truth the soul is trying to reveal. That is why so many people misunderstand surrender. Because they are handed the word before they are guided through the death it requires. And surrender does require a death. Not the death of love. The death of the ego's way of holding love. But if no one explains that, then of course the wounded self will assume surrender means losing the bond. The wounded self always interprets surrender through fear. Fear says, if I surrender, I will lose them. If I surrender, I am admitting the story is over. If I surrender, I am releasing the one thing that still gives my pain meaning. If I surrender, I will be left with nothing. That is the emotional reality many people live inside when they hear spiritual advice about surrender. So instead of becoming softer, they become more conflicted. They try to force surrender, perform surrender, mimic surrender. They say, I surrender, while internally still monitoring every sign. They say, I'm letting go, while emotionally bargaining with the future every day. They say, I trust divine timing, while feeling panicked if nothing moves externally. This is not hypocrisy. It is pain trying to obey a truth it has not yet fully embodied. And that deserves compassion. Because real surrender cannot be faked into existence. It has to be understood deeply enough that the heart stops translating it as abandonment. This is why surrender is so misunderstood in twin flame teachings. Because many teachings offer the instruction without honoring the psychology. They speak to the soul, but not the nervous system. They speak to the ideal, but not the wound. They speak to the truth, but not the terror that truth awakens inside the ego. And if you do not address the terror, the person will distort the truth, trying to survive it. That is what happens all the time. Someone still deeply in love hears surrender, and thinks they must shut down their heart. Someone still feeling the soul bond hears, let go, and thinks they must deny their inner knowing. Someone still hurting hears, stop chasing, and thinks they must become emotionally cold in order to qualify for union. None of those things are true surrender. They are reactions to misunderstood surrender. This is why we have to make something very clear. Surrender is not emotional numbness. Numbness closes the heart because it cannot bear the pain. Surrender keeps the heart open, but releases the need to control what love must become. That difference is everything. Numbness says, I will stop feeling so I do not suffer. Surrender says, I will stop gripping through fear, even while I still feel. Numbness is defensive. Surrender is truthful. Numbness is collapse. Surrender is release. Numbness abandons the inner world. Surrender returns you to it. This is why oversimplified teachings can be so harmful. Because they can accidentally push people towards shutdown while calling it healing. And shutdown is not healing. Spiritual bypassing is not healing. Passive waiting is not healing. Pretending not to care is not healing. Using surrender as a way to avoid your own emotional truth is not healing. Real surrender is far more alive than that. It does not ask you to betray what is real. It asks you to stop holding what is real through fear. That is a very different spiritual instruction. It means you can still love, still want union, still feel the bond deeply. But you stop using those feelings as a way to feed obsession, timeline panic, emotional collapse, and unconscious demand. That is why surrender sounds simple in language, but feels enormous in practice. Because what you are releasing is not a thought. You are releasing a whole structure. A structure built around checking, waiting, monitoring, hoping through fear, trying to predict movement, using signs as oxygen, using longing as identity, using the future as the place where peace is finally allowed. When people say surrender, without explaining that this is the structure being released, the teaching sounds shallow, almost insulting, because the person listening thinks, "You're telling me to just stop caring." But true surrender never asks that. It asks something much harder. Care deeply without making your care into control. Love deeply without turning love into emotional survival. Honor the bond without forcing the bond to become proof every day. That is far more demanding than simply letting go. And it is why surrender should be taught with more reverence than it often is. Because surrender is not a trick to get union faster. It is not a performance to make the universe reward you. It is not a strategy to get the runner back. It is a purification of how you relate to love. And purification always hurts the part of you that still wants to possess what should be trusted. That is why the ego hates surrender. Not because surrender is false. Because surrender removes the ego's favorite coping tools. Control, certainty seeking, overthinking, future clinging, and proof hunting. The ego would rather suffer noisily than rest in uncertainty. That is why people keep misunderstanding surrender as passivity or giving up. Because they cannot yet imagine a form of love that is both open and ungrasping. But that is exactly what surrender is teaching. Not less love. Cleaner love. Not less desire. Cleaner desire. Not less connection. Less distortion around the connection. And once this is understood, something begins softening. The word surrender stops sounding like punishment. It stops sounding like spiritual erasure. It stops sounding like the death of hope. Instead, it begins sounding like truth. Painful truth, yes. But living truth. The truth that the soul bond does not need fear to be real. The truth that love does not weaken when control falls away. The truth that peace does not come from getting every answer, but from no longer demanding answers in order to breathe. That is what most teachings fail to explain. And that is why so many people stay trapped in misunderstanding. They are trying to obey surrender without understanding its sacred function. But once you understand that surrender is not emotional shutdown, not giving up, not detachment as defense, not spiritual bypassing, the whole path changes. Now surrender becomes not a rejection of love, but an invitation to hold love differently. And once you begin seeing that, the next question becomes the deepest one of all. If surrender does not mean releasing the bond, then what exactly are you surrendering? Chapter 3: What you are actually surrendering. If surrender does not mean giving up on the bond, then what are you actually surrendering? This is the question that changes everything. Because once you understand the answer, surrender stops sounding like spiritual abandonment and starts revealing itself as one of the deepest acts of truth on the twin flame journey. Most people think surrender means releasing the person, releasing the love, releasing the hope, releasing the vision of union, releasing the connection itself. But that is not what true surrender asks of you. You are not surrendering the soul bond. You are surrendering what fear has wrapped around the soul bond. That is the difference. And that difference is everything. Because the bond itself may still be real, still sacred, still deeply alive inside you. What becomes unsustainable is not love. What becomes unsustainable is the way the ego has been trying to hold love. That is what surrender addresses. Not the truth. The distortion around the truth. So what are you really surrendering? You are surrendering control. That is the first and deepest layer. Control over timing. Control over how union must happen. Control over what signs mean. Control over the pace, the outcome, the form, the sequence, the certainty. The ego wants a map. It wants to know. When will they come back? What does this silence mean? Is this sign proof? Is union near? What should I do next to make this happen? And underneath all those questions is one more vulnerable truth. I do not feel safe inside uncertainty. That is why control becomes so seductive. Control seems like protection. If I can understand it, maybe I can survive it. If I can predict it, maybe it will not break me. If I can manage it spiritually, maybe I will not have to feel powerless. So you grip. Not because you are weak, because you are trying not to drown. That is human. But surrender asks you to release the grip. Not because the soul bond is false, because the grip itself is distorting how you are experiencing the soul bond. That is what you are surrendering. You are also surrendering force. This is the part people often do not want to admit exists. Because force is not always obvious. Sometimes it is loud. Chasing, texting, pushing, demanding answers. But often it is silent. Silent force. Trying to spiritually push the connection forward. Trying to will union into form through intensity. Trying to energetically hold everything together through obsession, signs, overfocus, and emotional effort. This kind of force often hides under beautiful language. I'm holding the connection. I'm trusting the bond. I'm staying open. And some of that may be sincere. But if underneath it is the hidden urgency. Please move, please happen, please become something I can finally hold. Then force is still present. Surrender asks you to release that force. Not because your desire is wrong. Because love that is sacred cannot be forced into truth through fear. You are also surrendering obsession. This is one of the most painful layers. Because obsession often feels like devotion. It feels spiritual, intense, meaningful, like proof that the bond is real. You think about them constantly. Replay memories. Decode signs. Check synchronicities. Build inner conversations. Track energy shifts. Live half in the present and half in the imagined future, where everything finally makes sense. And because this obsession is tied to a bond that feels holy, it can become very difficult to question. But obsession is still not surrender. Obsession is the mind trying to create safety through constant contact with the mystery. It is the ego saying, if I keep looking, maybe I won't lose it. That is not the same as love. That is fear staying close to love, so it does not have to feel the full ache of uncertainty. Surrender asks you to release obsession. Not because you stop caring. Because you stop making care dependent on mental overinvolvement. You also surrender attachment to the timeline. This one cuts deeply. Because the timeline becomes emotional structure on the twin flame path. Tomorrow might bring a sign. Next month might bring contact. This year might be the year of union. Maybe this portal, this cycle, this shift, this moon, this download means something is finally happening. Again, this is not foolish. It is the heart trying to survive the unknown. But over time, the timeline becomes a prison. You stop living today because your soul is emotionally staring at tomorrow. You stop breathing in the present because the future has become the place where peace is stored. That is why surrender asks you to release timeline attachment. Not because time is meaningless, but because your life cannot remain spiritually hostage to what has not yet visibly happened. You are surrendering the belief that union must arrive on a timetable your pain can emotionally tolerate. That is one of the hardest truths to accept. Because pain wants deadlines. Truth does not always move that way. You are also surrendering fear-based grasping. This may be the deepest layer of all. Because underneath control, force, obsession, and timeline attachment, there is often one ancient movement: grasping. The grasp of, don't leave. Don't disappear. Don't let this be for nothing. Don't make me release the one thing that still feels holy. Don't make me trust what I cannot yet hold. That grasp is usually not about the person alone. It is about what the person came to symbolize: home, completion, recognition, relief, the end of spiritual loneliness, the answer to a wound older than the relationship itself. So when surrender asks you to release the grasp, it feels unbearable. Because now it sounds like, release home, release hope, release the answer. But true surrender is not asking you to release truth. It is asking you to release the fear that is trying to possess truth. That is very different. This is why the deepest sentence in this entire chapter may be this: surrender is not releasing love. It is releasing the need to dominate love with fear. Read that slowly, because that is the real meaning. You are not surrendering what is sacred. You are surrendering the panic that has been clinging to what is sacred. You are not surrendering union. You are surrendering the insistence that union must happen in order for you to feel whole. You are not surrendering the bond. You are surrendering the ways you have unconsciously turned the bond into emotional survival. That is what makes surrender so holy. It is an inner purification, not a rejection, not a betrayal. A purification of the field through which you are relating to love. Before surrender, love may be mixed with fear, gripping, monitoring, proving, needing, waiting as identity. After surrender begins, love may still be there, powerfully there, but something has changed. It is cleaner, still deep, still real, still sacred, but less panicked, less controlling, less desperate to make the future arrive on command. This is why surrender can feel so strange at first. You may still think of them, still love them, still sense the bond. But the old emotional frenzy begins weakening. And because you have lived so long inside that frenzy, its absence can feel like loss. But often it is not loss. It is release. Release of the noise that made it difficult to hear the truth of the bond without fear distorting it. This does not mean surrender feels easy. It does not, because everything you are surrendering used to help you cope. Control helped you feel less helpless. Obsession helped you feel less far away. Signs helped you feel less abandoned. Timeline attachment helped you feel like the pain had a structure. So when surrender begins taking those supports away, the ego panics. It says, then what do I stand on? And the soul answers, truth. Just truth. Not fantasy. Not force. Not future clinging. Truth. The truth that love remains real even when you stop gripping it. The truth that the bond does not disappear because you stop monitoring it. The truth that what is meant for union does not need fear to keep it alive. This is what you are actually surrendering. The machinery of fear around love. And that machinery is heavy. It exhausts the nervous system, crowds the field of the connection, turns sacred feeling into emotional labor, turns hope into pressure, turns spiritual truth into constant inner emergency. Surrender is the moment you say, I will no longer carry this through panic. I will no longer use fear as my way of staying connected. I will no longer turn this bond into a place where my wounds demand control. That is not giving up. That is becoming honest enough to stop distorting what you love. And when that begins, another truth rises naturally. If surrender asks you to release so much of what the ego uses to feel safe, then why does it feel so painful, even when it is spiritual? Chapter 4: Why Surrender Feels Like Death to the Ego. If surrender is spiritual, then why does it hurt so much? Why does it feel like loss? Why does it feel like panic? Why does it feel, at times, almost unbearable? This is one of the most important questions on the twin flame journey. Because many people assume that if something is truly spiritual, it should feel peaceful right away. They think surrender should feel soft, graceful, freeing, almost beautiful from the beginning. But very often it does not. Very often, surrender feels like death. Not the death of love. Not the death of the soul bond. Not the death of what is sacred. It feels like death to the ego. And the ego does not die quietly. That is the truth almost no one explains deeply enough. Because the ego is not just arrogance or pride in the shallow sense. On this journey, the ego is the part of you that has built a whole inner structure to survive uncertainty, pain, longing, silence, and emotional powerlessness. It is the part of you that wants proof, wants control, wants answers, wants reassurance, wants movement, wants clarity, wants to know where this is going and when it will finally arrive. The ego says, "Tell me what this means. Tell me when union is coming. Tell me whether the signs are real. Tell me if they still feel this too. Tell me how to hold on without losing everything. Tell me how to stay safe inside a love I cannot control." That is the ego's voice. And on the twin flame journey, that voice becomes very loud. Not because you are weak, because the bond touches exactly what the ego cannot manage well: mystery. Mystery of timing. Mystery of separation. Mystery of another person's soul process. Mystery of why something can feel so real and still not yet take the form you want. The ego hates mystery. It would rather suffer inside certainty than rest inside the unknown. That is why surrender feels so painful. Because surrender takes away the ego's favorite tools. It removes the illusion of control. It removes the ritual of constant checking. It removes the emotional bargaining with signs. It removes the fantasy that enough analysis will finally produce safety. It removes the hope that if you just grip hard enough, think hard enough, interpret hard enough, wait hard enough, love hard enough, you can force the sacred to arrive in the exact way your fear can tolerate. That is what begins to die in surrender. And death, even holy death, is still felt as loss by the part of you that depended on what is being taken away. This is why surrender often feels more painful before it feels freeing. Because first, the ego experiences it as removal. No more overchecking signs for emotional oxygen. No more trying to decode every silence. No more making the future into the place where peace will finally be allowed. No more trying to spiritually negotiate with divine timing. To the soul, this is purification. To the ego, it feels like collapse. The ego says, "If I stop checking, I'll miss something. If I stop controlling, everything will disappear. If I stop holding this so tightly, the bond will fade. If I stop forcing meaning from every sign, then I'll be left with nothing but uncertainty." And uncertainty is what the ego fears most. Because uncertainty exposes helplessness. And helplessness is one of the deepest wounds the ego was built to protect you from. That is why surrender hurts. It is not just because you are releasing habits. You are being brought face to face with the part of yourself that does not know how to exist without certainty. That is a profound spiritual confrontation. Many people think the pain of surrender means they are doing it wrong. But often, the pain is proof that something false is losing power. The control is losing power. The obsession is losing power. The identity built around longing is losing power. The self that believed love had to be managed through fear is losing its throne. And of course that self panics. It says, "Do not release this. Do not soften now. Do not stop monitoring. Do not let go of the rituals that made the pain feel organized. Do not surrender, because surrender means you will disappear into not knowing. That is the ego's deepest terror. Not actually losing love. Losing control over how love is held. This is why surrender often feels like a kind of emotional free fall. You are no longer reaching for the old anchors. Signs. Fantasies. Mental rehearsals. Timeline obsession. Proof-seeking. Constant overanalysis. And without those anchors, the ego feels exposed. It does not yet know that what is beneath the fall is not destruction. It only knows that its old methods no longer work. That can feel terrifyingly empty. You may still love deeply. Still feel the bond. Still sense that something sacred is true. But the old ways of managing that truth begin dying. And when they die, there is often a stage where you feel stripped. Stripped of strategy. Stripped of emotional rituals. Stripped of the familiar chaos that at least made the connection feel active and alive. That stripped stage is sacred. But it rarely feels sacred while you are inside it. It feels raw. Because the ego is no longer performing the same function. And the soul has not yet fully taught you how to stand in truth without those old mechanisms. So there is an in-between space. A threshold. A place where the old self is dying and the new self is not yet fully embodied. That threshold is what many people mislabel as failure, numbness, confusion, or loss of the bond. But often, it is simply the place where the ego is losing authority. That is why surrender feels like death. Because it is the death of the self that equated control with devotion. The self that thought, if I love harder, maybe I can make it happen. If I analyze enough, maybe I can stay safe. If I keep the bond constantly active in my mind, maybe it won't disappear. If I suffer enough, maybe the universe will reward me with union. Those beliefs may not always be spoken aloud, but they live quietly beneath the surface. And surrender exposes them. Not to shame you, to free you. Because as long as those beliefs govern the connection, love keeps passing through fear before it reaches your heart. That is what makes the journey so exhausting. Not only the love itself, but the fear wrapped around the love. Surrender begins unwrapping it. And unwrapping fear is painful. Because fear resists being seen. Fear would rather call itself hope, devotion, spiritual knowing, staying open. But once surrender begins, you start seeing more clearly how much of your inner life was being organized around trying not to feel powerless. That realization can humble a person deeply. Because then you understand, I was not only loving, I was trying to survive through love. And survival mode is what surrender asks you to release. Not because survival was shameful. Because sacred love cannot be held by survival mode forever. At some point, something deeper is required. Trust without constant proof. Presence without constant control. Feeling without constant collapse. Love without turning the beloved into the answer for every unhealed wound. That is the soul's version of surrender. But to the ego, it still feels like loss at first. Loss of certainty. Loss of emotional structure. Loss of a role. This last one is especially important. Because many people on the twin flame path do not only attach to the person. They attach to the identity the journey gave them. The one who waits. The one who feels deeply. The one who sees the signs. The one who carries the bond through the silence. The one whose suffering proves the connection is real. Surrender threatens that identity too. Because if you are no longer obsessing, no longer chasing signs, no longer building your world around the timeline, then who are you? That question is not small. It is ego death. because the old identity cannot follow you into the next stage. The next stage asks for someone who can still love without making longing their personality. Someone who can still honor the bond without using it as emotional survival. Someone who can breathe in the present without handing all life over to the future. That self is very different from the one who began this journey. And becoming that self requires the death of the old one. That is why surrender hurts. Not because it is wrong. Because transformation always feels violent to the part of you that was built to resist it. But here is the deeper truth. What feels like death to the ego is often life to the soul. When control dies, truth breathes. When obsession dies, presence returns. When timeline panic dies, the heart becomes available to reality again. When fear loosens its grip, love becomes cleaner. That is what the ego cannot see at first. It thinks surrender means, I am losing everything. But the soul knows. You are losing what kept distorting everything. That is a completely different experience. And this is why surrender is not the destruction of love. It is the destruction of everything in you that tried to make love obey fear. So if surrender feels painful, do not rush to conclude that something is wrong. Do not rush to go back into checking, gripping, obsessing, or forcing just because the death feels uncomfortable. Sometimes discomfort is the proof that the old throne is collapsing. The ego is no longer ruling the bond in the same way. And that is holy. Because once the ego loses its throne, another question becomes possible. If surrender is not just the collapse of control, then what are the false versions of surrender that look spiritual, but are actually just new forms of defense? Chapter 5: The False Versions of Surrender. One of the most dangerous things on the twin flame journey is not just misunderstanding surrender. It is mistaking false surrender for real surrender. Because not everything that looks like letting go is actually surrender. Sometimes it is pain. Sometimes it is defense. Sometimes it is exhaustion wearing spiritual language. Sometimes it is hopelessness pretending to be wisdom. And if you do not know the difference, you can end up abandoning your own heart while telling yourself you are healing. That is why this chapter matters so much. Because real surrender is sacred. But false surrender can be another form of self-betrayal. And many people fall into it without realizing it. Why? Because once the journey becomes painful enough, the ego becomes very creative. If it cannot control love directly anymore, it will often try to survive by creating a new identity around letting go. But underneath that identity, the same fear is still running the show. That is what makes false surrender so deceptive. It sounds spiritual. It may even look calm from the outside. But inside, it is still structured by fear. The first false version of surrender is emotional shutdown. This is one of the most common. A person gets hurt enough times, disappointed enough times, spiritually exhausted enough times, and eventually they decide, I'm done. Not in the deep, peaceful sense. In the wounded sense. They numb out. They harden. They stop feeling as much, or at least they try to. They stop allowing tenderness because tenderness has become associated with suffering. Then they call that surrender. But that is not surrender. That is self-protection. It is the heart closing because it no longer trusts openness. Real surrender does not close the heart. It keeps the heart open while releasing control. That is a huge difference. Shutdown says, I will stop feeling so this cannot hurt me. Surrender says, I will still feel, but I will no longer grip through fear. Shutdown is armored. Surrender is undefended but grounded. Shutdown is pain becoming cold. Surrender is pain becoming honest. The second false version of surrender is pretending not to care. This can look subtle. A person still deeply wants union, still feels the bond, I don't even care anymore. I'm over it. It doesn't matter. Whatever happens, happens. Sometimes that is true surrender. But often it is emotional suppression, a performance of detachment. And performances do not free the soul. They only create distance between what you feel and what you allow yourself to admit. This is why pretending not to care is so dangerous. Because it teaches the heart to distrust its own truth. And twin flame surrender is never about distrusting truth. It is about releasing fear's ownership of truth. You can still care deeply. You can still love. Still honor the bond. Still hold the possibility of union in your heart. Surrender does not ask you to lie about that. It asks you to stop turning those truths into panic-driven control. The third false version of surrender is passive waiting. This one is especially common in spiritual spaces. A person stops chasing outwardly, but inwardly they are still frozen around the timeline. They are still waiting for union to begin life. Still living as if their soul is in suspended animation until the other person returns. They call this surrender because they are not doing anything. But inner passivity is not surrender. If your whole life is still emotionally paused, if your peace is still on hold, if your identity is still built around not yet, then the old attachment may still be alive, just wearing quieter clothing. Real surrender is not passive. It is deeply active inwardly. It is the active release of control, the active return to self, the active choice not to abandon yourself while truth unfolds. Passive waiting says, I will just sit here until destiny does something. Surrender says, I will fully live, fully return to myself, and stop making the future the only place where peace is allowed. The fourth false version of surrender is spiritual bypassing. This happens when someone uses spiritual language to avoid emotional truth. They say, I trust divine timing. I'm surrendered. Everything is happening for a reason. It's all unfolding perfectly. And maybe part of that is true. But if beneath those words the person is still terrified, still heartbroken, still clinging, still unwilling to feel their own grief, then the words are being used as escape. That is not surrender. That is bypassing pain with concepts. And concepts cannot do the soul's work for you. You cannot affirm your way into surrender if your body is still bracing against reality. You cannot speak peace into existence while your nervous system is still structuring itself around fear, and you refuse to acknowledge that fear honestly. Real surrender includes the wound. It does not erase it. It says, yes, this hurts. Yes, I am afraid. Yes, part of me still wants certainty. And still, I am no longer willing to let fear govern how I hold this bond. That is real. Bypassing is not. The fifth false version of surrender is hopeless resignation. This one often comes after long pain. A person gets so exhausted that they stop resisting, but not because they have found peace, because they have lost hope. They say, fine, whatever, it's over. I surrender. But what they really mean is, I cannot bear the disappointment anymore. That is not surrender. That is despair. And despair is very different from sacred release. Despair closes the future because it can no longer tolerate uncertainty. Surrender does not close the future. It simply releases the demand to control it. This is a very important distinction. Hopeless resignation feels heavy, bitter, shut down, flat, almost lifeless. Real surrender, even when painful, still has life in it, still has openness, still has truth, still has softness beneath the grief. Despair says, I give up because I no longer believe. Surrender says, I release control even though I still cannot see the whole path. Those are worlds apart. The sixth false version of surrender is performing emotional independence. This one is more subtle, but very common. A person wants to prove to themselves, to the universe, maybe even to the runner, that they are healed now. So they overcorrect. They become hyper-independent, emotionally distant, ultra-composed, almost proud of not needing anyone. On the surface, it can look empowering. But often this is just another defense. A more sophisticated defense, yes, but still fear-based. Because real surrender does not need to prove anything. It does not say, "Look how detached I am now." It simply becomes quieter, cleaner, more truthful, less interested in performance. A person who has truly surrendered is not acting healed. They are becoming honest. That honesty may still include longing, still include tenderness, still include uncertainty, but it no longer includes so much force. That is what makes it real. So how can you tell the difference between false surrender and true surrender? Here is the simplest way. False surrender closes the heart in some way. True surrender keeps the heart open, but stops the grasping. That is the line. If what you call surrender makes you more numb, more bitter, more shut down, more self-abandoning, more spiritually performative, or more emotionally absent from your own truth, it may not be surrender at all. It may be defense. Real surrender feels different. Not easy. Different. It may still ache. Still grieve. Still not know exactly what comes next. But it does not require pretending. It does not require freezing your life. It does not require lying about what you feel. It does not require turning your heart to stone. Instead, it sounds more like this. I still love. I still feel the bond. I still do not have all the answers. But I am no longer willing to hold this through panic, force, or self-abandonment. That is surrender. Quiet, not dead. Soft, not weak. Open, not desperate. And that is why false surrender is so tempting. Because it is easier to shut down than to stay open without control. It is easier to pretend not to care than to care without gripping. It is easier to become bitter than to remain vulnerable while releasing the timeline. But the soul does not want easier. It wants truth. Truth without performance. Truth without fear pretending to be wisdom. Truth without shutting down the very heart that union is meant to purify. This is why surrender is not a pose. It is not a look. Not a phrase. Not a spiritual brand of calmness. It is an inner condition. An inner condition where love remains but fear no longer gets to direct it. That is the difference between false surrender and true surrender. And once you understand that, the next question becomes profoundly healing. If real surrender is not numbness, not resignation, not bypassing, not passive waiting, then what does real surrender actually feel like in the body, in the heart, and in the soul? Chapter 6: What real surrender actually feels like. If surrender is not giving up, not shutting down, not pretending not to care, not passive waiting, not bitterness, not emotional numbness, then what does real surrender actually feel like? This is the question almost no one answers clearly. Because surrender sounds beautiful as a spiritual idea. But for the person actually living the twin flame journey, ideas are not enough. The heart wants to know. What does surrender feel like in the body? In the nervous system? In the silence? In the moments when I still love them, still feel the bond, and yet know I can no longer keep living inside panic? That is where this chapter begins. And the first truth is this. Real surrender does not feel like sudden perfection. It does not feel like waking up one morning completely healed, completely calm, completely detached from all pain, no longer affected by the person, no longer caring about union, no longer feeling the ache of separation. That is not surrender. That is fantasy. Real surrender is much quieter than that. More human than that. More honest than that. It often begins as a strange softening. A softening of the fight. A softening of the inner gripping. A softening of the frantic need to know, to predict, to decode, to control. You may still love them. Deeply. You may still think of them. Still feel the bond. Still sense that something sacred exists between you. But the way you hold those feelings begins changing. That is the first real sign. Before surrender, the connection often feels like emotional emergency. Every sign matters too much. Every silence hurts too much. Every possible movement becomes loaded with meaning. The future becomes the place where your nervous system keeps trying to live. After surrender begins, the bond may still feel real, but it stops feeling like constant crisis. That is a profound shift. It is not that your love becomes smaller. It becomes less contaminated by panic. And that changes everything. Real surrender often feels quieter. Not empty. Not numb. Not dead. Quieter. The mind stops screaming quite so much. The heart stops reaching outward every second. The body is no longer in the same state of internal emergency all day long. This can feel very unfamiliar at first. In fact, many people misread it. They think, why am I calmer? Why am I not obsessing the same way? Why am I not checking signs every hour? Why do I still care, but without the same intensity? Am I losing the connection? But real surrender often feels quieter precisely because the old distortion is weakening. The bond is still there. What begins fading is the noise around the bond. The fear. The grasping. The overanalysis. The emotional force. And when those things start loosening, the soul feels different inside itself. Not because love has disappeared. Because the ego is no longer making love into a battlefield every hour. Real surrender also feels cleaner. This is very important. Before surrender, your connection to the bond may be mixed with so many things at once. Love, fear, hope, grief, obsession, fantasy, desperation, timeline panic, spiritual overinterpretation. Everything gets tangled. You do not only feel them. You feel your wounds through them. You feel your future through them. You feel your need for certainty through them. You feel your fear of loss through them. So the emotional field becomes crowded. Real surrender begins clearing that crowd. Not all at once. Not in one perfect spiritual moment. But piece by piece. The fear loses some power. The timeline loses some power. The signs lose some power. The need to constantly translate everything into meaning loses some power. And what remains is cleaner. You still love. But the love no longer has to carry so much noise. That is why surrender can feel strangely peaceful and painful at the same time. Peaceful, because the inner war is softening. Painful, because without all the noise, you begin meeting the truth more directly. And truth without distortion can be deeply humbling. Because now you are not just living inside fantasy. You are feeling what is real. What is real may still include love. Still include longing. Still include mystery. But it no longer includes so much self-created chaos. That is healing. Real surrender also feels like less panic. Not no pain. Less panic. That distinction matters. Many people think surrender should erase longing. It usually does not, at least not immediately. You may still miss them. Still wonder about them. Still feel waves of sadness or tenderness or soul-deep ache. But the panic begins weakening. The feeling of, I need something to happen now. I need a sign now. I need to know what this means now. I cannot breathe if nothing moves. That begins softening. And once that panic softens, the whole journey feels different. Because panic is what turns the bond into emotional survival. Surrender removes the survival layer. Not by making you cold, by making you more grounded. This is why real surrender often feels like you are still feeling the bond, but no longer using it as your only source of inner stability. That is huge. It means you can think of them without collapsing as often. Feel them without spiraling as often. Sense the connection without handing your whole nervous system over to the next sign. This is not the loss of depth. It is the beginning of real depth. Because love becomes deeper when it no longer needs chaos to feel powerful. Real surrender also feels like still loving, but without constant collapse. This may be the most healing sentence of all for many people. Because one of the biggest fears on this path is, if I surrender, I will have to stop loving. If I truly let go, I will have to deny what I feel. If I stop chasing, I will have to betray my own heart. But no, real surrender often sounds more like this. I still love you. I still feel what this is. But I am no longer willing to die inside that love every day. That is the shift. Love remains. Collapse weakens. Before surrender, love and collapse may have felt fused. To love was to ache uncontrollably. To feel the bond was to lose yourself. To sense the connection was to be pulled into emotional emergency. After surrender begins, that fusion starts breaking apart. You can still love, but you do not collapse every time you love. You can still feel, but you do not disappear inside the feeling. You can still want union, but you no longer relate to union like it is the only place where your soul is allowed to rest. That is incredibly important, because that is what makes surrender strong, not passive. It is the moment when love stops being the place where you abandon yourself. Real surrender also feels like you still want union, but not from desperation. This is one of the clearest signs. Before surrender, union may feel like rescue. The answer. The solution. The end of the pain. The moment life finally begins again. After surrender begins, you may still deeply desire union. But now the desire is less frantic. Less gripping. Less, I need this or I will break. Less, this must happen for me to feel whole. Instead, the desire becomes more honest, more spacious, more mature, more rooted in truth than in desperation. You may still say internally, yes, I still want this. Yes, I still honor this bond. Yes, part of me still believes union matters. But now there is less force behind it. And that lack of force can feel strange at first. Because the ego confuses force with devotion. But devotion does not need force. Real devotion can remain open without trying to dominate the future. This is what real surrender often feels like in the body. Your shoulders soften a little. Your breathing becomes less tight. Your chest is still tender, but not always clenched. Your thoughts are still deep, but less compulsive. Your body is no longer constantly bracing for signs, silence, or disappointment in the same old way. This does not mean all triggers vanish, but the nervous system starts learning a new posture. Not chase, not collapse. Presence. Presence with uncertainty. Presence with longing. Presence with mystery. That is sacred maturity. Real surrender also feels like you stop abandoning yourself. This may be the deepest layer of all. Before surrender, much of the journey may have been lived outward. What are they doing? What does this sign mean? Is union close? Why are they silent? What should I interpret from this shift? Everything points outward. After surrender begins, the energy returns inward. not in selfishness. In wholeness. You start asking, how am I holding myself? Where am I still living in panic? What part of me still believes I must lose myself to prove this love is real? What does truth feel like in me when fear stops speaking so loudly? That return to self is one of the most sacred sensations of surrender. Because for the first time, the bond is no longer taking you away from yourself. It is bringing you back. Back to the places where your inner masculine and feminine are still at war. Back to the wounded child who thinks love must be chased. Back to the part of you that made longing into identity. And as you return, something changes. The war inside begins softening. That is why surrender can feel like grief and relief at the same time. Grief, because the old way of loving is dying. Relief, because the old way was exhausting you. This is also why real surrender does not always feel dramatic. It often feels simple. A simpler breath. A simpler truth. A simpler relationship to the bond. Not less sacred. Less distorted. And sometimes that simplicity is hard for the ego to trust. It says, this cannot be it. This is too quiet. Too ordinary. Too calm. But the soul knows. This is what love feels like when fear stops driving it so aggressively. So if you are asking what real surrender feels like, here is the deepest answer. It feels like the heart remains open, while the hands unclench. It feels like still loving without trying to force. Still wanting without trying to possess. Still feeling without turning feeling into an emergency. Still honoring the bond without abandoning yourself to the timeline. That is real surrender. Not dramatic. Not performative. Not numb. Quiet. Clean. Tender. Strong. And once you begin feeling that, something else becomes possible. The entire energy of the connection starts changing. Because what happens to the bond when it is no longer being held through fear? Chapter 7: Why Surrender Changes the Energy of the Connection. One of the deepest fears on the twin flame journey is this. If I truly surrender, will the connection weaken? If I stop chasing, stop gripping, stop monitoring every sign, stop forcing meaning out of silence, stop making the future my emotional oxygen, will I lose the bond itself? That fear is so common. And it makes sense. Because for a long time, many people have been relating to the connection through intensity, through constant emotional involvement, through longing, panic, overanalysis, and the hidden belief that if they do not keep holding the bond in some active way, it might disappear. So when surrender begins, the ego immediately panics. If I release control, won't I lose momentum? If I stop feeding this so intensely, won't the connection die? If I let go of the old urgency, won't everything go silent forever? But the deeper truth is often the exact opposite. Surrender does not weaken the connection. It changes the energy of the connection. And that change is not loss. It is purification. That is one of the most important truths on the entire twin flame path. Because for a long time, the bond may be real, deeply real, but the field around the bond is crowded. Crowded with fear. Crowded with timeline pressure. Crowded with obsession. Crowded with spiritual overreach. Crowded with emotional collapse, longing, and the desperate need to make something happen before the ego can no longer tolerate uncertainty. All of that creates energetic noise. And noise changes how the connection is felt. It makes it heavier, more charged, more reactive, more painful, more difficult for truth to move cleanly through. This is why surrender matters so much. Because surrender begins removing the noise. Not the bond. The noise around the bond. And once the noise starts clearing, the energy begins changing in ways that can feel almost shocking. The old panic weakens. The old pressure softens. The old runner-chaser charge starts losing oxygen. The field no longer feels as emotionally congested as before. That is not a small shift. That is enormous. Because the connection is no longer being held mainly through fear. And anything sacred held through fear eventually becomes distorted. Fear turns love into pressure. Fear turns longing into demand. Fear turns signs into addiction. Fear turns separation into identity. Fear turns union into something the ego wants to possess rather than receive. Surrender interrupts that whole structure. It does not say the bond is false. It says, the bond can no longer be carried through distortion if it is to become what it was always meant to become. That is why surrender changes the energy so profoundly. Before surrender, the field may sound like this. Come back. Prove this. Resolve this. Do not leave me in not knowing. Do not make me carry this pain without visible meaning. Even if none of those thoughts are spoken aloud, the emotional field can still be full of them. And that field creates pressure. Pressure on the connection. Pressure on the runner. Pressure on yourself. Pressure on divine timing itself. The soul bond is still there. But it is breathing through a room filled with emotional smoke. Surrender opens the windows. That is what it does. It lets the air move again. It lets truth breathe again. It lets the bond exist without being wrapped so tightly in fear. And when that happens, the connection often becomes quieter but deeper. This is another paradox people misread. They think quieter means weaker. But quieter often means cleaner. The old spiritual static fades. The dramatic charge lowers. The constant internal reaching softens. And beneath all of that, something much more real emerges. The actual connection. Not the panicked version. Not the fantasy-driven version. Not the version filtered through constant survival mode. The truer version. And the truer version often feels less intoxicating to the ego, but far more sacred to the soul. Because now love is not trying to force itself into form through fear. It is simply becoming itself. This is why surrender changes the runner-chaser dynamic so much. The old dynamic thrives on energetic imbalance. One reaches. One retreats. One intensifies. One avoids. One lives in urgency. One reacts to pressure. That creates movement, yes. But it is wounded movement. It creates cycles, not peace. Intensity, not stability. Return and retreat, not truth anchored in the field. When surrender begins, that old charge starts weakening. The chaser no longer feeds the field through panic as strongly. The silence no longer carries the same emotional demand. The future is no longer being unconsciously squeezed for reassurance every day. And because of that, the runner often feels the field differently too. The connection no longer presses on them in the same way. The old demand is lower. The old overcharge is weaker. Now what remains is not a field trying to pull them through force. It is a field becoming safe enough for recognition. That is what surrender does. It does not make the bond disappear. It makes the bond more truthful, more breathable, more approachable, more capable of being consciously met rather than defensively resisted. This is also why surrender can change how signs appear. Before surrender, signs may feel frantic. You look for them everywhere. Need them constantly. Use them as proof that the bond is still alive. After surrender begins, signs may still come, sometimes even more clearly, but your relationship to them changes. You no longer need them to survive the day. You no longer grip them for certainty in the same way. You notice them, but you are not consumed by them. That matters. because the field is no longer using signs as emotional life support. Now signs can simply be what they are. Reflections, not rescue. This same shift happens with the silence. Before surrender, silence can feel violent, like abandonment, like punishment, like the absence of movement proving something is wrong. After surrender begins, silence may still ache, but it does not dominate the whole inner world in the same way. It becomes less personal, less catastrophic, less full of forced interpretation. And in that lighter silence, the connection often changes character. It stops feeling like a battlefield and starts feeling more like a mystery you no longer need to conquer in order to breathe. That is sacred, because conquest is ego, receptivity is soul, and surrender moves the connection from conquest toward receptivity. This is also why so many people say the bond felt different after true surrender. Not gone. Different. More peaceful. Less dramatic. Less tangled with fear. Still present, still real, still alive, but without the same emotional violence. That difference is exactly the point, because a connection that is meant for union cannot remain forever shaped by the same wound patterns. That separation exposed. At some point, something has to purify. At some point, fear has to loosen. Control has to loosen. The need to possess the future has to loosen. Surrender is that loosening. And what it creates is not emptiness. It creates space. Space is one of the holiest things on this path. Space for truth. Space for breath. Space for the soul to speak without the ego constantly interrupting. Space for the runner to feel without the same energetic pressure. Space for the chaser to remain open without collapsing. This is why surrender changes the energy of the connection so deeply. Because the field no longer says, "Resolve me now." Now it says, "There is something real here, and I no longer need fear to prove it." That is a completely different vibration. And vibrations matter. Because the runner feels vibration before they understand it in words. The field itself becomes less demanding, less charged, less loaded with unconscious pressure. And once that happens, the old defenses often begin weakening too. What once felt overwhelming begins feeling more approachable. What once triggered retreat begins allowing recognition. What once felt like emotional force begins feeling like truth. That is the beginning of real change. This is why surrender is not passive. It is transformative. It transforms the bond from something held through distortion into something that can begin moving. Through clarity. Not perfect clarity, but more truth than before. And truth changes everything. It changes how you wait, how you feel, how you love, how you interpret silence, how the runner experiences the field, how union becomes possible. So if you have been afraid that surrender will weaken the connection, hear this clearly. What surrender weakens is not the bond. It weakens the fear wrapped around the bond. It weakens the emotional noise, the compulsive grasping, the pressure that made the sacred harder to feel cleanly. And in that weakening, something beautiful begins. The connection becomes less dramatic and more real, less painful in its distortion, and more powerful in its truth. That is why surrender changes the energy of the connection. Because the moment love is no longer being held through fear, it can finally begin revealing what it actually is. And once that begins, another deeper truth naturally rises. Surrender is not only about the field between you and them. It is also about the war inside you ending. Chapter 8: Surrender and Inner Union. At a certain point on the twin flame journey, a deeper truth begins to emerge. Surrender is not only about releasing control over the other person. It is not only about trusting divine timing. It is not only about no longer chasing signs, forcing movement, or gripping the future with fear. Surrender is also about something much more intimate. It is about the war inside you ending. That is where this chapter begins. Because for a long time, most people experience the twin flame connection as something happening between two people. There is the runner, the chaser, the silence, the longing, the signs, the separation, the hope of union, and all of that is real. But underneath the outer story, another story is unfolding the whole time. The story of what is happening within you. The story of the divided self. The story of the inner masculine and feminine still at odds. The story of the abandoned child still waiting to be chosen. The story of the controlling mind trying to manage what only the soul can hold. The story of the heart wanting love while the nervous system still expects pain. That is the hidden battlefield. And until that battlefield begins healing, surrender will always feel incomplete. Because real surrender is not just, I let them go. It is also, I stop abandoning myself inside this journey. That is one of the deepest meanings of surrender in twin flame union. You stop abandoning yourself to the timeline. Stop abandoning yourself to the signs. Stop abandoning yourself to the emotional highs and lows of the connection. Stop abandoning yourself to the version of love that always requires you to lose your center in order to prove devotion. That is inner union beginning. Because before surrender, the inner world is often split. One part of you trusts the bond. Another part panics constantly. One part of you believes in divine timing. Another part wants proof right now. One part of you feels deep soul recognition. Another part is terrified of being wrong. One part wants to soften. Another part wants to control. One part says, this is sacred. Another part says, I cannot survive if this does not happen. That split creates enormous suffering. Not only because the other person is absent, but because you are divided inside yourself. And division inside the self always turns love into conflict. This is why surrender is so deeply tied to inner union. Because surrender is the moment you stop asking one part of yourself to destroy another in the name of love. The mind no longer gets to terrorize the heart. The fear no longer gets to rule the soul. The wounded child no longer gets to define the whole meaning of the bond. The external journey no longer gets to own your internal peace. That does not happen all at once. But it begins in surrender. It begins when you stop making the outer relationship the only place where union can happen. That is a profound shift. Because for a long time, the pain may have made it feel as if union was only something out there. Something that will happen when they come back, when they awaken, when the silence breaks, when contact returns, when the future finally becomes what your soul has been waiting for. But surrender reveals something much deeper. The outer union cannot truly stabilize while the inner war remains untouched. That is why this path is so much more than romance. It is initiation. An initiation into wholeness. Not perfect wholeness. Living wholeness. Honest wholeness. The kind of wholeness that says, I can still love deeply without splitting myself apart. I can still feel the bond without abandoning my own center. I can still honor what is sacred without handing my inner authority over to uncertainty. That is inner union. And surrender is what makes it possible. Because surrender removes the false ruler. Control. As long as control rules the inner world, the masculine within you remains distorted. It becomes harsh, rigid, hypervigilant, always demanding answers. Always trying to force direction out of mystery. And as long as fear rules your emotional life, the feminine within you remains wounded. She becomes collapsed, overextended, waiting to be rescued by outer movement, confusing suffering with devotion. This is what many people do not realize. The twin flame path often exposes not only the wounds between two souls, but the imbalance within your own inner masculine and feminine. The inner masculine says, I must fix this, solve this, control this, know this. The inner feminine says, I feel everything and I am drowning in it. Neither side is at peace. Neither side trusts. Neither side is in sacred relationship with the other. So the whole inner field becomes unstable. That is why surrender is not just about the other person. It is about your inner masculine finally relaxing his grip on control, and your inner feminine finally no longer begging the future to save her. That is huge, because when those two parts begin reconciling, something inside you softens in a completely different way. The mind no longer has to dominate the mystery. The heart no longer has to collapse beneath the mystery. The one who protects and the one who feels begin learning how to stand together. That is inner union. The masculine within you becomes more grounded, less controlling, more able to hold uncertainty without panic. The feminine within you becomes more open, less desperate, more able to feel deeply without losing herself. This is what real surrender starts building. Not emptiness. Integration. And integration changes the meaning of everything. Now silence is not just abandonment. It becomes a place where you can remain with yourself. Now longing is not just pain. It becomes a place where you can witness what still aches without turning ache into identity. Now the bond is not just something you wait for externally. It becomes a mirror revealing where your own inner polarities are still calling for healing. That is why surrender is inseparable from inner union. Because the moment you stop chasing externally, the inner world becomes impossible to ignore. You begin seeing, where am I still split? Where am I still leaving myself? Where am I still expecting the outer union to solve what only inner reconciliation can heal? These questions are not punishment. They are doorway questions. And every time you answer them honestly, surrender deepens. Not as passivity, as self-return. This is why so many people feel strangely stronger after true surrender begins. Not because the pain vanishes, but because their center starts returning. They stop scattering themselves into the future. Stop pouring all their emotional energy into signs. Stop treating the bond as the only place where wholeness is possible. Instead, they begin becoming a place inside themselves where wholeness can actually grow. That is sacred. And this is where the deepest paradox appears. The more inner union begins, the less the outer union has to function as rescue. That does not make outer union less meaningful. It makes it more real. Because now, if union comes, it is not arriving to patch an inner civil war. It is arriving to meet a soul that has begun ending that war within. That is what surrender prepares. Not merely reunion with another person. Reunion with yourself. Reunion between the parts of you that have been living as strangers. Between trust and feeling. Between surrender and strength. Between the heart and the self that knows how to hold the heart without controlling it. That is why the twin flame path can never be reduced to getting them back. It is always also about returning to yourself in a more truthful way. And surrender is the bridge. The bridge from fragmentation to inner union. From panic to presence. From emotional dependency to sacred openness. From outer obsession to inner reconciliation. This is also why true surrender feels so dignified. Not dramatic. Dignified. Because there is a quiet nobility in no longer abandoning yourself while you love. In no longer handing your peace over to the timeline. In no longer making the future your emotional master. In no longer confusing collapse with devotion. That dignity is part of inner union. It is the moment the soul says, I will still love, but I will no longer disappear inside this love. That is not coldness. That is wholeness beginning. And once wholeness begins, the bond changes too. Because now the connection is not only being held by longing, it is being held by a soul that is becoming internally coherent. That coherence matters more than most people understand. Because the outer world always reflects the deeper structure within. If the inner world is war, the bond is experienced as war. If the inner world is panic, the bond is experienced through panic. If the inner world begins reconciling, then the connection starts being felt through more truth and less distortion. That is why surrender and inner union are inseparable. Surrender is not losing the other. It is stopping the loss of yourself. And when that loss ends, the whole journey becomes different. Not easier in a shallow sense. Cleaner. Stronger. More capable of holding what sacred love actually asks of a human heart. So if you are in a stage where surrender is pulling you inward where the outer story still matters, but something deeper is happening inside you where you feel called not only to release control over them, but to end the war within yourself. Do not resist that. That is not the journey becoming less spiritual. That is the journey becoming more real. Because the real meaning of surrender in twin flame union is not just, I release what I cannot control. It is also, I stop dividing myself in the name of love. And once that begins, another truth becomes visible. Often, this inner surrender, this reconciliation, this cleansing, this ending of force, happens right before the outer world begins to shift. Chapter 9: Why Surrender Often Happens Right Before Union. There is a reason surrender feels like such a final threshold on the twin flame journey. Because very often it is. Not the end of the story. Not the end of love. Not the end of the bond. But the end of the old way the bond was being held. And that is why surrender so often happens right before union. This is one of the deepest paradoxes of the entire path. Most people believe union comes when longing reaches its peak, when the signs become louder, when the pain becomes unbearable enough, when the soul has suffered enough to earn the next chapter. But that is not usually how sacred movement works. Very often, union becomes possible not when force reaches its highest point, but when force finally dies. That is what surrender changes. Because before surrender, even real love can still be tangled with fear, with control, with obsession, with the need to make something happen so the nervous system can finally rest. The bond may be sacred, yes, but the field around it is still crowded. Crowded with urgency. Crowded with emotional pressure. Crowded with the silent demand that the connection must now become visible, must now become clear, must now become union in the form the ego can tolerate. That crowding matters. Because a crowded field cannot receive cleanly. A crowded field keeps translating the bond through panic, through hope crash cycles, through constant interpretation, through the ache of trying to force mystery into certainty. And as long as the field is held that way, even if the love is real, the energy often cannot settle into union truthfully. Why? Because union is not only about two souls feeling something. It is about whether the field between them can now hold what it once distorted. That is the deeper law. A connection can be real for years, profound for years, sacred for years, and still not yet be able to take form in a stable, truthful way if it is being filtered through the same old emotional machinery. That is why surrender so often comes first. Because surrender clears the field. Not by erasing the love. By removing what has been interfering with the love. The control. The panic. The spiritual grasping. The need to force signs into reassurance. The need to use union as rescue. the subtle ways the ego keeps trying to possess what should be received. This is why surrender is not separate from union. It prepares union. It is the threshold where the soul says, I can no longer hold this through fear. And that sentence changes everything. Because once fear stops holding the bond the same way, the energy becomes different. Quieter. Cleaner. Less charged by desperation. More spacious. More breathable. This can feel deeply confusing in real time. Because many people mistake this quieter stage for loss. They think, why am I less frantic? Why am I not obsessing the same way? Why does the bond still feel real, but somehow calmer? Why does the old intensity seem to be fading? Am I getting farther away from union? But what if the opposite is true? What if the old intensity was not proof of closeness, but proof of distortion? What if the quieter field is not distance from union, but preparation for it? That is the truth many souls only recognize afterward. Because the ego expects union to arrive like a reward for emotional intensity. But the soul often receives union only after emotional intensity is no longer being used to control. The sacred. That is the key. Union is not strengthened by fear trying harder. Union becomes possible when fear is no longer structuring the field. That is why surrender often happens right before visible change. Because visible change may require an invisible purification first. The runner-chaser charge has to weaken. The old obsession has to weaken. The need to use signs as emotional oxygen has to weaken. The inner war has to soften. And then, sometimes quietly, something begins shifting. The signs may feel different. The silence may feel different. The runner may feel the field differently. The connection no longer carries the same dense atmosphere of need. And in that lighter field, movement becomes possible in a new way. This is why people often say things like, everything changed when I finally let go. They reached out when I stopped chasing. The moment I stopped forcing it, something shifted. These phrases get repeated so often they almost sound cliché. But there is a real spiritual truth underneath them. It is not that surrender earns union like some transaction. It is that surrender stops feeding the very distortions that made union harder to receive cleanly. That is a huge difference. The soul is not rewarding you for performing detachment. It is responding to a field that is no longer so crowded with fear. Think of it like this. If you are trying to see your reflection in water that is constantly being agitated, the reflection will always be broken. Not because the image is not there, but because the surface is too disturbed. Surrender is the calming of the water. It does not create the reflection. It reveals it. That is why surrender so often precedes union. Not because surrender causes love to suddenly exist, but because surrender reveals what love is when fear stops distorting the surface quite so aggressively. And once love is felt more clearly, both souls can begin meeting something more truthful than before. This is also why surrender often feels like nothing happening right before everything changes. The old drama dies. The old emotional performance dies. The old story that suffering must always be loud dies. And what replaces it is not immediate fireworks. It is stillness. Stillness before movement. Stillness before clarity. Stillness before truth takes form. To the ego, this stillness feels suspicious. It says, surely union should feel more dramatic. Surely something bigger should be happening. Surely if love is close, I should feel more intensity, not less. But the soul knows something deeper. When the field becomes clean enough, truth no longer needs to scream. That is why surrender is such a sacred threshold. Because it marks the moment when you stop trying to dominate mystery and become willing to receive it. That willingness changes the whole atmosphere of the connection. Now the bond is not being held through. Come now, prove this, save me, resolve me. Now it is being held through. There is something real here, and I no longer need to force it through fear. That is, the field union can actually breathe in. Not a field of emotional emergency. A field of truth. And truth is less theatrical than fantasy, but far more powerful. This is why so many real energetic shifts happen after surrender, not before. Because before surrender, you may still be unconsciously demanding that union arrive in order to end your suffering. After surrender, you begin allowing truth to unfold without making it carry the entire burden of your pain. That is maturity. Spiritual maturity. Emotional maturity. Soul maturity. And union is much closer to that frequency than to the frequency of grasping. This is also where inner union matters deeply. Because once surrender begins inside you, the outer union is no longer being asked to solve an inner civil war. The masculine within you is no longer trying to force the path. The feminine within you is no longer collapsing beneath the path. Something reconciles. And from that reconciliation, the outer world often starts responding differently. Not because you controlled it, because you stopped trying to. That is the paradox. The soul often receives union only after the ego stops trying to possess it. And possession can wear so many disguises. Possessing through signs, through obsession, through timeline control, through holding the connection with fear-based intensity, through needing outer movement to validate inner truth. Surrender ends that possession. And what takes its place is openness. Not passive openness. Sacred openness. The kind that says, I still love. I still honor this bond. But I no longer need to force this into form to know it matters. That sentence alone changes the field. Because the bond is no longer being squeezed by panic. It is being allowed. And what is allowed often moves more honestly than what is forced. So if you are in a stage where surrender is happening, where the old intensity is softening, where your grip on the future is loosening, where the bond still feels real, but less entangled with emotional emergency, do not mistake that for stagnation. You may be standing at the very threshold. Not because surrender guarantees a script, but because surrender removes what could not go with you into real union. That is why it often happens right before union. Because what comes next cannot be carried by the same old self. The old self chased. The old self panicked. The old self turned love into pressure. The old self needed proof every day. But the new self is learning something else. How to remain open without grasping. How to love without collapsing. How to trust without forcing. How to let the sacred breathe. That is, the self-union can meet. And if that self is emerging in you now, then something holy is already underway. Even if the outer world has not yet fully shown it. Because the deepest movements often happen here first. In the surrender. In the unclenching. In the quiet death of force. And from that death, something new becomes possible. Not the old cycle. Not the old distortion. Something truer. Something the soul may have been preparing for all along. That is why surrender so often happens right before union. Because before the sacred can be received, the fear that tried to possess it must finally let go. Chapter 10: The Final Truth. Surrender was never the loss of love, but the return to truth. So now we arrive at the deepest truth of all. Not the truth the ego wanted. Not a formula. Not a shortcut. Not a guarantee that if you surrender today, union will appear tomorrow in the exact way your heart has imagined. But something deeper than prediction. Something holier than control. If you have followed this journey all the way here, then you already know something important. Surrender was never about losing the bond. It was never about becoming numb. Never about pretending you no longer care. Never about shutting down your heart because the longing became too heavy. Never about giving up on love and calling that wisdom. Surrender was always about something else. It was about the death of fear's control over love. That is the final truth. Because for so long, maybe you thought surrender meant the end of hope. But what if surrender was never the end of hope? What if it was the end of panic? What if it was the end of the version of you that kept trying to survive this bond through obsession? Overthinking, signs, timelines, emotional collapse, and the desperate need to know what comes next. That is what was dying. Not the sacred. The distortion around the sacred. And when distortion begins dying, it can feel brutal. Because the old self does not go quietly. The old self wanted certainty. Wanted proof. Wanted reassurance. Wanted union to come in a form that would finally calm every wound, answer every fear, and justify every year of pain. But sacred union was never meant to be the reward for fear. It was meant to be what remains when fear no longer rules the field. That is why surrender had to happen. Not because love failed. Because love was too real to keep being carried through panic. And maybe that is the deepest message of this entire journey. You were never being asked to love less. You were being asked to love more truthfully. To stop calling control devotion. To stop calling collapse openness. To stop calling obsession loyalty. To stop calling fear holding the connection. That is the purification surrender brings. It strips away everything false that tried to speak in love's voice. And once those false things start falling away, something remarkable happens. Love remains. Quieter, perhaps. Cleaner, perhaps. Less dramatic, perhaps. But still there. Still real. Still sacred. Still alive. Only now, it is no longer demanding to be held through force. That is the real meaning of surrender in twin flame union. Not the closing of the heart. The unclenching of the heart. Not the rejection of desire. The release of desperation. Not the abandonment of union. The ending of the belief that union must come in order for you to finally become whole. That is why surrender changes everything. Because once you stop abandoning yourself to the future, the soul begins returning to the present. And in that return, something begins healing that is even deeper than the outer relationship. The war inside you begins softening. The part of you that wanted control begins meeting the part of you that wanted trust. The part of you that panicked begins meeting the part of you that already knew. The part of you that chased begins meeting the part of you that was exhausted from running after. Certainty. That inner meeting is sacred. Because in many ways, surrender was always leading you there. Not just to union with another person, but to union within yourself. To the place where love no longer has to pass through inner war in order to be felt. That is what makes the final stage so powerful. You may still love. You may still feel the bond. You may still sense that something unfinished, something profound, something soul level remains true between you. But now, that truth no longer owns you through fear. It no longer takes your whole nervous system hostage. It no longer forces you to live in not yet. It no longer requires constant signs to stay alive. Now the love is changing shape. And that change is holy. Because the love is no longer being asked to perform as rescue. It is being allowed to exist as truth. This is why surrender often happens right before union. Because union cannot be held by the same self that was built around control. The old self can long for union, dream of union, suffer for union, but it cannot hold union cleanly. Only the self that has begun releasing fear's grip can do that. Only the self that has stopped trying to possess the sacred can receive it. That is the threshold. And if you are standing there now, in that strange, quiet, painful, sacred place where the old intensity is dying and something truer is beginning to breathe, then hear this carefully. You are not losing love. You are losing what distorted it. You are not losing the bond. You are losing the panic that wrapped itself around the bond and called it self-devotion. You are not losing your spiritual path. You are shedding the old self that could only walk that path through fear. That is not failure. That is transformation. And transformation rarely flatters the ego. It strips. It empties. It humbles. It asks you to stand without the old supports. But what remains after that stripping is more real than anything the ego could have built. A quieter heart. A steadier soul. A love that does not need to scream. A truth that no longer depends on control in order to feel sacred. That is the kind of heart union can meet. Not because it is perfect, but because it is finally honest. So maybe the deepest question is no longer, when will union happen? Maybe now the deeper question is, what in me is finally becoming able to receive union without turning it back into fear? That question changes the whole journey. Because now the goal is no longer only outer arrival. It is inner truth. And once inner truth begins leading, the outer story is no longer being written by the same old panic. That is the miracle hidden inside surrender. Not that you stopped loving. That you stopped trying to make fear the ruler of what love means. That is why surrender was never the end of the journey. It was the doorway. The doorway out of emotional captivity. The doorway out of the runner-chaser distortion. The doorway out of the version of love that always required you to lose yourself to prove its depth. And on the other side of that doorway is not emptiness. It is reality. Cleaner reality. Truer reality. A love no longer built on force. A heart no longer addicted to uncertainty. A soul no longer asking the future to validate what it can finally feel inwardly. That is the real union path. Not fantasy fulfilled. Truth embodied. So if surrender feels painful, do not assume something is wrong. Sometimes pain is simply the sound of the false leaving. Sometimes the old self has to grieve what it can no longer control. Sometimes the soul has to learn that love is still real even when fear is no longer steering it. Sometimes the heart has to discover that openness and control were never the same thing. And when that discovery finally lands, something beautiful happens. You stop calling the loss of distortion the loss of love. And from there, the whole path becomes different. Quieter, yes. But deeper. Less dramatic, yes. But more sacred. Less ruled by the ego's timetable. And more aligned with the soul's truth. That is the final message of this video. Surrender was never about becoming empty. It was about becoming true. And truth is the only place where sacred union can finally breathe. If this message found you at the exact right time, write in the comments. I release control, not love. And if you are walking the twin flame journey through surrender, soul awakening, inner union, and deep spiritual truth, subscribe to the channel, because here, we do not just talk about twin flames as fantasy. We talk about the real psychology, the spiritual purification, and the soul-level transformation that makes true union possible. And if this video spoke to you, share it with someone who fears that surrender means losing the connection when in truth, surrender may be the very doorway through which real union begins.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.